We expect the evidence, all of the evidence, to show that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, was responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. We expect the defense, in an anemic effort to deflect suspicion away from Mr. Oswald, to offer theories, speculation, conjecture, but not one speck of credible evidence that any other person or group murdered President Kennedy and framed Lee Harvey Oswald for the murder that they committed. As this trial unfolds, you will see how utterly preposterous the allegation of a frame-up is. The evidence will show that on the morning of the assassination, November the 22nd, 1963, Oswald carried his weapon, a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle, into his place of employment at the Texas School Book Depository building. The presidential motorcade was scheduled to pass right in front of that building that very noon. At 12:30 p.m., as the president's limousine drove slowly by, 3 shots rang out from the southeasternmost window on the 6th floor of that building, one of which penetrated President Kennedy's upper right back, exited the front of his throat, another entering the right rear of his head and exiting and shattering the right frontal area of his head. As the presidential limousine screeched away to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead, the president, his lifeblood gushing from his body, lay mortally wounded in his wife Jacqueline's lap. Within minutes of the assassination, Oswald's rifle was found on the same 6th floor, the floor from which Oswald had brutally cut down at the age of only 46, the 35th president of these United States. The evidence will show that Oswald's rifle, to the exclusion of all other weapons, was determined by firearms experts to be the rifle that fired the 2 bullets that struck down President Kennedy. The evidence will further show that just 45 minutes after the assassination, Oswald, in frantic flight from what he had just done, shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, running from the scene of the murder to a theater where he was arrested and subdued after drawing his revolver on one of the arresting officers. Much more evidence, ladies and gentlemen, much more will be produced at this trial, irresistibly connecting Oswald and no other person or group to the assassination. I have every confidence that after you folks fairly and objectively evaluate all of the evidence in this case, you will find that Lee Harvey Oswald, and Lee Harvey Oswald alone, was responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
You heard Mr. Bugliosi come up and tell you where the shots were fired from. That's in dispute. There's hardly anybody in the country that doesn't dispute it. We'll find out that there is only one way, ladies and gentlemen, that you can ever determine where the bullet came from. Did it come from back or the front? Mr. Bugliosi wants to make sure that it came from the back, because if it came from the back, he can claim that it was Lee. But if there is evidence that it came from the front, it was somebody else. When this case is over, ladies and gentlemen, you'll go back to the jury room. There will be one verdict, unfortunately, that you can return, and that is a verdict that says we don't know. We just don't know.
Okay. Now, Mr. Frazier, was there one time that Mr. Oswald asked you to drive him back to Irving that was not on a Friday?
Yes, sir, he did.
Was that on November the 21st, 1963, a Thursday?
Yes, sir.
The day before President Kennedy was assassinated?
Yes, sir.
And what did you say to him?
He asked me, could he ride home, and I said, sure, you can ride home with me anytime. And then I thought, and I said, well, why do you want to go home with me tonight? And he told me that he was going home to get some curtain rods for his apartment from Miss Paine.
Okay, so that evening after work, you brought Mr. Oswald back to Irving, is that correct?
That's correct.
The following morning, Friday, November the 22nd, 1963, did anything unusual happen while you were eating breakfast?
Yes, sir, it did. Lee looked, had come down to my home, and he had looked in the kitchen window.
Okay, he hadn't done that before?
No, sir.
Eventually, you and he got into your car?
Yes, sir.
When you got into the car, did you notice that he'd put something in the back seat?
Yes, sir. As I was getting in the car, I noticed a package on the back seat.
Did you ask him what it was, and if so, what did he say?
Yes, sir, I did ask him, and he says, you know, that's the curtain rods that I was going to pick up from Miss Paine.
Okay. Once you arrived at the book depository building that morning, where did you park your car?
In the employee parking lot.
As I understand it, when the two of you got out of the car, he started walking ahead of you to the entrance of the building. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As he was walking ahead of you, was he carrying the bag that had been on the back seat?
Yes, sir.
Did you recall how he was carrying the bag?
Yes, sir. He was carrying it parallel to his body.
Okay, so he carried the bag right next to his body on the right side?
Yes, sir, on the right side.
Was it cupped in his hand and under his armpit? I think you've said that in the past.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Frazier, is it true that you paid hardly any attention to this bag?
That is true.
So the bag could have been protruding out in front of his body and you wouldn't have been able to see it. Is that correct?
That is true.
Mr. Frazier, I understand you watched the presidential motorcade from outside the front door of the book depository building. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you heard the rifle shots?
Yes, sir.
How many did you hear?
3.
After the shooting that afternoon, was there a roll call of employees to see if all the employees had returned to the building?
Yes, sir, there was.
Were all employees present at the time of the roll call, or was anyone missing?
Everyone was present except Mr. Oswald.
He was the only employee who was missing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. No further questions.
Spence?
You and I have never talked together, have we?
No, sir.
It's the first time you and I have ever met, isn't it?
That's correct.
You've gone over your testimony in some detail with Mr. Bugliosi.
I've talked with Mr. Pelosi a couple of times, but not in any in-depth.
Mr. Spence, I know...
Just a minute. If you're going to make any address anywhere, Mr. Bugliosi, you'll stand on your
Okay,
feet.
Mr. Spence, my name is pronounced Bugliosi. The G is silent. I've told you this several times. I know it's difficult, but I try to do it, okay?
That's the only thing that's
An
silent
Italian
about
G
Mr.
before L
Bugliosi,
silent.
Your Honor,
Please,
is the
jury will
G.
disregard that sidebar remark for any purpose at all. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Frazier, I'm sorry I had to call you back to witness stand. Exhibit 21A, can we have that on the screen now? Mr. Frazier, this fellow here in the doorway of the book depository building, do you know who he is?
Yes, sir.
Who is he?
That's Billy Lovelady.
And who's Billy Lovelady?
Billy Lovelady was a employee of Texas School Books.
Okay. Were you standing near Billy at the time that photograph was taken?
Yes, sir. I was standing back up in the shadows there where you can't see me up several steps back, but I was in the shadows and he was standing down in front of me.
And this is when the presidential limousine was driving by.
Yes, sir.
Does Mr. Lovelady resemble Lee Harvey Oswald?
No, sir, except one thing. They both had kind of a high forehead.
Right.
But one was short and stocky, which Billy was, and Lee Harvey Oswald was more of a thin type frame.
You speak in the past tense. Billy has passed away.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
And you excuse me just a minute, Mr. Frazier. You may have some additional cross-examination.
You were way back in the shadows, you say?
Yes, sir, I'm back in the shadows there.
How far back, sir?
Oh, there's, I would say 3 or 4 steps back up there in the shadows.
Like about the distance between, say, you and me?
No, sir.
A little closer?
A little closer.
About like this distance.
Come right about in there, sir.
And you recall these 23 years later that Mr. Lovelady was standing in front of you at that precise moment, about 4 steps in front of you. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is.
Have you ever said that to anybody in the world prior to today?
I don't know where anyone asked me that or not.
Yeah, but my question is, did you ever tell that to anybody in the world prior to today?
Not that I know of, sir.
But you did tell that to Mr. Bugliosi with the G silent, didn't you?
Well, I answered his question a while ago, sir.
Yes. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you. You may step down and tell us your name.
My name is Charles Brem.
Directing your attention, Mr. Brem, to approximately 12:30 p.m. on the date November the 22nd, 1963, the day of President Kennedy's assassination, were you and your 5-year-old son in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas, watching the motorcade, the presidential motorcade?
Yes, we were.
Did you form any opinion as to the location from which the 3 shots you heard came?
I told the officers that it came from one of the two buildings, one of which was the school book depository, the other one over that corner, one of the two.
You feel very confident about that?
Yes, sir, I do.
In other words, you feel the shots, you believe the shots came from behind the president. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
No further questions.
Tell us your name.
Harold Norman,
Where do you live, Mr. Norman?
Dallas, Texas.
Thank you.
Well, I heard a shot when the motorcade came by. The first shot seemed like the president slumped. Then I heard two more shots.
So you heard a total of 3 shots.
Yes, sir.
Did it sound to you like a rifle was being fired directly above you?
Yes, sir.
Was there any other reason, in addition to the sound of the rifle, any other reason why you believe the shots were coming from directly above you?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
Because I could hear the empty hulls, that's what I call them, hit the floor, and I could hear the bolt action of the rifle being pushed back and forward.
You're familiar with a bolt-action rifle?
Yes,
Now,
sir.
by hulls, you mean cartridge casings.
Cartridges.
How many did you hear falling to the floor?
3.
Is the sound of that bolt action and the ejection of the cartridge casings and they're falling to the floor something that you're going to remember for the rest of your life?
Yes, sir.
Give us the rhythm of the sounds of these shots. Was it bam, 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 or what was it?
As I recall, the rhythm of the sounds of shots were boom, click, click, boom, click, click, boom, click, click.
Just all even.
Yes, sir.
Even.
Tell us your name.
Eugene Boone,
Where you live, Mr. Boone?
Abilene, Texas.
Now on the screen is a photograph, Mr. Boone, of stacks of cartons or boxes near a window. Do you recognize what is depicted in this photograph?
The box is on the inside of the southeast building, southeast floor of the 6th floor of the school book depository, southeast corner.
When you arrived on the 6th floor, is this the way the cartons were stacked around that window?
Yes, sir.
So you could almost say there was a sniper's nest around that window.
Yes, sir.
How long after the shots that you heard did you arrive?
Excuse me. But it seems to me, Your Honor, that this man has been leading all morning, over and over again, even to the point that he had one witness led into what he would remember forever. And I object to that. Now, I just want the record to show that I object to that. And if you want me not to make any further objections on that kind, I'd like the record to reveal that you've instructed me not to do that, not to make any more such objections, and I'll not make any. But I want you to know that I do object to the continuous leading questions of counsel.
Keep on your feet, Mr. Spence, if you would, please. Sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Spence, my ruling is you can make any objection that you want to. Don't ever tell the court that you're just standing up and you know that it is a waste of time because you don't get any of them. I don't just decide, except on the basis of the law as I feel it is, whether your objection is good or whether it's bad. As to what it looked like, I sustained as to what it looked like. You can make your description on that part only. Thank you, sir. You may be seated.
Now, may I have a ruling on my objection, please?
Yes, sir. I sustained as to what it looked like, as to the sniper's bit.
May I have a ruling on whether or not it was leading?
It was leading.
Thank
Yes,
you, Your
sir.
Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Billios.
What do those cartons and boxes look like to you?
It looked like an attempt to hide something on the other side.
If someone had been walking on that 6th floor and someone was behind those boxes, could the person behind the boxes have been seen?
They would be concealed from either the elevator or the stairwell across the building.
Did you eventually spot a rifle on the 6th floor, Mr. Boone?
Yes, sir, I did.
Exhibit 14, do you recognize what is depicted in this photograph?
Yes, sir. The rifle?
The rifle that you saw on the 6th floor.
Yes, sir.
Is that the way the rifle looked when you found it?
Yes, sir.
When you first looked at the weapon, Mr. Boone, did you mistakenly take it for a 7.65 millimeter Mauser?
Yes, sir.
And why did you think it was a Mauser?
Well, Mauser basically refers to the bolt action, and there were a lot of military weapons around at that point in time.
Is Mauser kind of a generic term for a bolt-action rifle?
Yes, sir.
Very briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Boone, did the FBI ever show you a rifle which they said was a rifle found on the 6th floor?
Yes, sir.
And what did you say when you looked at that rifle?
It appears to be the rifle that I saw on the 6th floor of the school book depository.
Well, didn't you just tell Mr. Spence that you could not identify it?
I could not identify it positively because I did not have an identifying mark on the weapon.
Okay, but it appeared to be the same
It
rifle.
appeared to be the same
Ask
weapon.
and answer.
Thank you. No further questions.
Tell us your name, please.
Marion L. Baker.
Directing your attention to the date November the 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination. Were you a police officer with the Dallas Police Department?
Yes, sir, I was.
Were you assigned to ride a motorcycle in the presidential motorcade that day?
Yes, sir. Right here on the 2nd floor landing, as I came out of the stairways, there was a door facing me. And through this window in the door, I saw a movement. And then I went over and opened the door, and I saw this man walking away from me.
What did you say to him, if anything?
I called to him and said, come here. He turned around and started walking back towards me.
Okay. Was Mr. Truly at your side?
Yes, sir. Mr. Truly was at my side.
That's the superintendent of the building?
Yes, sir, it is.
Did you ask him who the man was?
Yes, sir, I
He
did.
told you it was Lee Oswald.
Yes, sir.
Did he appear out of breath?
No, sir.
Do you recall how he was dressed?
No, sir.
Mr. Baker, other than Lee Harvey Oswald, did you see anyone else at all on the 2nd floor?
No, sir.
You may sit down, sir. Mr. Baker, as I understand it, at a later time, March the 20th, 1964, you timed how long it would have taken Mr. Oswald, if he had fired the shots from the southeasternmost window of the 6th floor, to have gotten down to the 2nd floor lunchroom where you confronted him. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You determined that Oswald would have had enough time to get to where you confronted him. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. No further questions.
Have a seat there, please. Tell us your name.
My name's Ted Calloway.
Thank you.
I was standing on the front porch of our office, and when I heard what sounded like 5 pistol shots, I was right here on this porch,
All right.
and the shots sounded like they were coming from this direction on 10th Street.
Okay. Now, when you heard these shots, what did you do at that point?
I ran out to the sidewalk on Patton Street.
Okay. Would you use your pointer to point out the locations involved?
Yes, I just ran from here out to the sidewalk.
Okay. Again, with the pointer, would you tell the jury what you observed at that point?
I saw a man running from this front yard on 10th Street across the street, which would be the west side of Patton.
Did he have anything in either of his hands?
Yes, sir, he had a pistol in his right hand.
Okay. How was he carrying the pistol?
He was carrying it in a raised pistol position,
Would you demonstrate that for the jury?
like this.
Did he run past you where you were?
No, he ran toward me. I
All right.
was on the east side. He was on the west side of Patton.
What's the closest you came to him?
The FBI measured it at about 56 feet.
Okay.
And
Did you get a good, clear view of him?
very good view.
Did you talk to him at all?
Yes, sir.
What did you say to him, and what did he say to you, if anything?
I hollered at him. I said, hey, man, what the hell's going on? And he slowed almost to a halt, turned in my direction, still had his pistol this direction. He said something to me, which I couldn't understand it. Then he proceeded to run toward Jefferson through this front yard right here and proceeded west on 10th on Jefferson Street.
Let's take a look at the photo of Oswald. Looking at Lee Harvey Oswald, is he or is he not the man that you saw that day?
That's the man, yes, sir.
Any question in your mind about that, sir?
None whatsoever.
Okay, you may sit down here. Thank you.
Don't you think it is pretty apparent that the police wanted you to identify the man who looked different, the man who had a black eye, the man who had cuts on his face, the man who wasn't dressed in suit and tie? Don't you think that was pretty obvious to you?
No, sir, it sure doesn't.
Didn't you want to help the police wrap this up good and tight against this man whom they told you was the killer of the president?
No, sir, I wanted to do just exactly what the chief of detectives told me, to take my time
to be sure and to be absolutely positive in making my identification.
Do you think you could have made the identification if you'd have had 4 men, all of them with identical marks on their face, a cut over their eye, a black eye, marks? Do you think that you would have then been able to make the identification?
I could have made it, sir, if they'd been naked.
Call your next witness.
The government calls Jack Brewer.
Yes, sir, if you would, please, if you come forward.
Would you describe what happened after you heard on the radio that an officer had been shot?
Shortly after that, there were police cars, sirens, I heard, that were traveling down Zangs and Jefferson Boulevard.
Westbound on Jefferson?
Yes.
Right.
And a short time later, this man walked into the lobby of my store.
Did you get a good look at his face?
Yes, I did.
How far away were you from him?
Probably around 10 feet.
Okay, A2, photograph Mr. Oswald. That's Lee Harvey Oswald, of course. Is he or is he not the man that was standing in front of your store on the occasion in question?
Yes, that is.
Okay, could you describe his physical appearance?
Well, his hair was somewhat messed up. He looked as though he had been running. He looked scared.
Okay, did you feel there was anything suspicious about him apart from his physical appearance?
Well, the fact that he was standing and facing me with his back to the street while all of the commotion was going on outside, I thought that quite unusual.
Did you get the impression that he was trying to ignore the police sirens?
Exactly, yes.
Did the police cars eventually make a U-turn on Jefferson and start going eastbound?
Yes, they made their U-turn, and when they did, Oswald, or the man that stepped into the recessed area, looked over his shoulder, seemed to make sure that they had gone by, and then stepped out back onto the sidewalk and walked up toward the Texas Theater.
How far is the Texas Theater from your store?
It's in the same block, approximately 50 to 60 yards.
So he started walking towards the Texas Theater. What did you do at that time?
I stepped out from my store and stood on the sidewalk and watched him walk up toward the Texas Theater and saw him enter the theater. Just a few moments later, the house lights in the theater came on. I looked out from the curtain and saw Oswald for the first time in the theater. As the house lights came on, he got up from his seat, walked to the aisle, and then turned around and sat back down approximately the same seat that he had been occupying.
Okay. What's the next thing that happened, sir?
After I saw Oswald, then I heard a noise outside. I opened the exit door. I was grabbed by the policeman. In fact, a gun was held on me. I explained to them that a suspect or a suspicious person was in the theater. They asked me to point him out, which I walked out on the stage with a couple of policemen, pointed him out, and the policeman approached him, walked down the aisle toward him, approached him. As the policeman walked into the aisle that Oswald was sitting in, Oswald stood up. He hollered something. I'm not sure what he hollered. And he struck the officer, knocking him backwards. As he had done this, he reached under his shirt and pulled out a revolver. The officer stood back up. Having been knocked down, he stood back up and grabbed at the revolver. There was quite a scuffle there for a few moments. And he was handcuffed and led away.
No further questions. Dr. Petty, were you one of 9 forensic pathologists from around the country chosen by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977 to serve on the autopsy panel reinvestigating the assassination of President Kennedy?
I was.
And what was the conclusion your panel came to as to how many bullets struck the president, their point of entry, and the path they took through the president's body?
My conclusion and the conclusion of the panel was that the president was struck by 2 bullets, one entering the right upper back and exiting in the front of the neck. the other entering the right back of the head and exiting in the what we call the right frontal area, that is the front inside of the head.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Doctor, whatsoever, that both bullets that struck the President came from the rear and no bullet struck him from the front?
None whatsoever.
Doctors, I'm sure you're well aware one of the principal contention of the critics is that President Kennedy's head snap to the rear around frames 315 to 320 on the Zapruder film means, in the eyes of the critics, some of them, that he must have been struck by a bullet from the front. You're aware of that contention?
Yes, I am.
What conclusion did your panel come to with respect to this head snap to the rear?
The head snap to the rear, in the view of the panel, was that this was an automatic, involuntary reaction on the part of the President's nerves and muscles. There was a blast inside the head, the nerves were fired off, and the muscles were set into action. The muscles in the back are stronger than the muscles in the front, and so therefore the head moved backward.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Petty. Assuming the President had been struck by a bullet from the front, make that assumption, could the transference of momentum from that bullet have thrown the President backward, as is shown in frames 315 to 320 of the Zapruder film?
No, sir, not in my opinion.
And why is that?
No, because the head is too heavy. There's too much muscular resistance to movement.
So the killings that people see on television and in the movies, which is the only type of killings most people ever see, where the person struck by the bullet very frequently, visibly, and dramatically is propelled backward by the force of the bullets. That's not what actually happens in life when a bullet hits a human being.
No, of course not.
Dr. Petty, did you also seek to ascertain how many bullets struck Governor Connally, their point of entry, and the path they followed once they entered his body?
Yes.
And your panel arrived at a conclusion.
That is correct.
Did you tell the jury what conclusion your panel reached with respect to Governor Connally?
The panel concluded that the governor was struck in the back, that the bullet circled around the outside of the chest, exited beneath the right nipple, went on to continue through his wrist, and then on into his thigh. The right wrist, the left thigh.
Doctor, now on the screen to your left is the bullet purportedly removed from Governor Connally's stretcher. Did your panel examine this bullet?
Yes.
You saw the actual bullet?
Yes.
Could this bullet have ended up in this relatively pristine condition if it had entered the President's back, exited his throat, then entered Governor Connally's back near his right armpit, and taken the path through Governor Connally's body you have just described?
Yes, of
Would you
course.
explain to the jury how you arrive at this conclusion?
This bullet is a full metal jacket military bullet designed to pass through the soft tissues of an individual, exactly as it did in President Kennedy's instance. It then contacted bone only in two areas. First, the rib in Connally, and second, the wrist bone in Connally. In neither instance did it penetrate the rib or the wrist bone. It easily travels through such soft tissues as that without great deformity.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. No further questions.
Tell us your name and where you live.
Last name is Guinn, G-U-I-N-N. First name Vincent, middle name Perry. I live in the San Diego area, California.
Do you conclude that CE-842, the Connally wrist fragments, came from CE-399, the Connally stretcher bullet?
Yes, I do.
And CE-843, the fragments removed from President Kennedy's brain, CE-840, the fragments found on the rear floor of the limousine, and CE-567, the fragment found on the front seat, all came from the same bullet?
Yes, I do.
So there's no evidence that more than two bullets hit anyone or anything inside the presidential limousine?
That's correct, and there is solid evidence that there were two.
Doctor, you're aware that firearms experts have concluded that the Connally stretcher bullet was fired from Oswald's Carcano rifle. Is that correct?
Yes.
You're also aware that firearms experts have concluded that the two large bullet fragments found on the front seat of the presidential limousine, one of which you analyzed, were also fired from Oswald's Carcano rifle. Is that correct?
Yes.
What you're saying is that from your neutron activation analysis, there may have been 50 people firing at President Kennedy that day. Is that correct? But if there were, they all missed. Only bullets fired from Oswald's Carcano rifle hit the president. Is that correct?
That's a correct statement, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Guinn. No further questions.
Tell us your name.
I'm Ruth Paine.
Mrs. Paine, your occupation, ma'am?
I'm a school psychologist. I work with school children.
You're aware, Mrs. Paine, that I'm going to be asking you questions today about your relationship with Lee Oswald and his wife, Marina.
Yes.
Though the events about which you will be testifying happened many years ago, are they still relatively fresh in your mind?
They're very fresh in my mind.
And is that because of the historic importance of what ultimately happened?
Well, yes, certainly that. And it was a major national tragedy and a personal tragedy for me.
When the president was murdered?
Yes.
So Oswald remained in New Orleans, and you brought Marina and June, the daughter, back to live with you in Irving.
That's right.
Did Marina join him when he returned to Dallas, or did she
No,
continue
she
to stay
stayed
with you?
on. Plan was for her to stay at least until their second baby was born, and she could gather her strength, and then she would join him.
Mrs. Paine, I believe you had something to do with Mr. Oswald beginning to work at the Texas School Book Depository building. Would you tell the jury about that, please?
Surely. Marina and I were having coffee with the next-door neighbor about a week after Lee had come back to the area, and he had had trouble all that week trying to get work. And another neighbor who was there said that her brother was working at the Texas School Book Depository, and he had mentioned that they may have more openings there. So I called the School Book Depository and talked with the personnel director there, and he didn't say whether there was an opening, but he said that the young man I mentioned to him should apply in person, and told Lee that when he called at the house. And I guess he did apply the next day and got the job. And was quite elated about that.
Okay, now between mid-October 1963 and November the 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination, would Mr. Oswald visit his wife Marina at your home?
Yes, he'd come out on weekends regularly.
Did he ever deviate from that pattern?
Well, just the weekend prior to the assassination, he did not come out.
Okay, but whenever he did come out to visit Marina, it was always invariably, without exception, Friday night, and then he'd go back Monday morning. Is that correct?
After he's working, yes. Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Paine, on Thursday, November the 21st, 1963, did anything unusual happen with respect to Mr. Oswald?
Well, yes, he came out that night, and it was the first night he'd come out on a weeknight, and it was the first time he'd ever come without asking permission.
And you were surprised?
I was very surprised, yes.
Was Marina a little embarrassed and surprised that...
She was, yes. She said to me, she apologized for his not asking whether he could come, and she expressed her surprise.
To the best of your recollection, when did you first see him that Thursday evening?
I saw him, it was about 5:30 in the evening. I had just gotten back from grocery shopping, and he was already there. They were on the front lawn talking when I arrived.
Okay. Do you recall saying anything to him as you entered the home?
Yes.
What did you say to him?
I said, our president is coming, and I was very excited about it. He didn't really reply. He sort of brushed on by and said, oh, yeah, this was in Russian.
He said, da, or what?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Around 9 p.m., do you recall what you did?
Yes, at 9, when my children were tucked in for the evening, I went into the garage to paint some blocks that I had made for my children.
When you entered your garage around 9 p.m., did you notice anything unusual?
Yes, the overhead light was on when I went in.
And you hadn't been in the garage earlier that evening?
No, I had not.
Were you under the impression that either Marina or Mr. Oswald had left the light on?
I doubt seriously it could have been Marina. She was very good at turning out the lights if she ever went in there, and then I could hear her moving about. I knew where she was during the evening. So as I walked into the garage and found the light on, it was my clear impression that Oswald had been there and left it on carelessly.
But you did not physically see him enter the garage?
No, I did not.
There's been testimony at this trial from Mr. Frazier that Mr. Oswald told him that the reason he came to your home that Thursday night was to get some curtain rods from you. For his room on Beckley Street. While he was at your home, did he ask you for any curtain rods?
No, he didn't.
Did he ever at any time ask you for curtain rods?
No.
Was there any discussion between you and him or you and Marina about curtain rods?
No.
Now, you in fact did have some curtain rods
Yes.
in the garage, is that correct?
In the garage, yes.
After the assassination, they were still there?
Yes, that's right. Well, the next thing, they announced on the television that the president had died, and very shortly after that, there were 6 officers that came to my front door from the Sheriff's Department and Dallas Police Department and asked to come in.
They want to search the home?
Yes, they did.
Did they eventually search the garage?
Yes, they went pretty immediately to the garage.
While in the garage, did the officers ask you if Oswald had any guns or weapons?
One of the officers asked if he had any guns, and I said no. And then I translated the question to Marina, who said yes, that he had a gun. And she indicated a blanket roll on the floor in the garage, pointed to it.
When Marina pointed to the blanket in your presence, did the officers check to see if the rifle was still in the blanket?
Yes, he picked it up and it bent over his arm, limp, like a rag. It was clearly empty.
Did Marina move out of your home after the assassination, ma'am?
Yes, she did.
Were you able to discern how Lee Harvey Oswald viewed the world about him?
I think he saw the world as hostile, and he really had very little good to say about other people.
Were you able to discern how Oswald viewed himself?
I think he had kind of an
Oh,
inflated...
these are such, you know...
Rule 701 questions,
Well,
Your Honor.
but I don't care whether it's Rule 1957.
I'm going to sustain as to what he himself felt. You can give your observations, Ms. Paine.
As to what he felt.
No, what you saw and observed. You can't tell what he felt.
Right,
You weren't
okay.
in his body. You
I
don't
get
know
you.
what he felt. Understand?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, were you able to discern how Oswald viewed himself?
That's the same question?
Oh, it's a different question, Your Honor.
I could see...
I sustain.
I think I could...
Please, just a minute.
Yeah.
See, the judge sustained it. That means you can't answer. I know you didn't realize that, but that means you can't answer the question.
Why don't I just say how he spoke?
Well, all right, sure, you can tell how he spoke. I think you've already figured it out, Ms. Paine. How did he speak?
Well,
Judge, you can't expect me to figure it out. I'm only the lawyer in the case, so...
He spoke with derision about other people, and proud of himself and his ability.
All right.
Do you feel he wanted to be recognized as a great man someday?
I think he thought he was pretty special, and that others did not see him that way, but that he thought that others might in some time.
Do you feel he was a reliable person, someone upon whom one could depend?
I was disturbed that he didn't really support his wife. He was certainly not doing things that would help her or be a person that she could count on. I was worried because he seemed very touchy, very apt to take offense if you disagreed with him. And I've said, I think, that I was concerned at first. I was worried about even asking Marina to come and stay with me because I felt he might take offense at that.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Paine.
Your witness, Mr. Spence. You may cross-examine.
Mr. Spence, I can understand your feeling.
No, please. I'm just asking a question. I'm entitled to an answer. This is cross-examination, Mrs. Paine. What do you think he would have said? If you had accused him face to face of being unreliable, what do you think he would have said?
I think he would have bristled and probably not said anything.
Now that's really the truth, isn't it, Mrs. Paine? You
What?
didn't like him very well, did you?
Didn't like him very well. I wasn't trying to hurt him, though.
I say you didn't like him very well, did
No,
you?
I didn't like him very well.
As a matter of fact, you were having trouble with your own husband at the time, weren't you?
We were separated, planning
Yes.
to get a divorce.
You, of course, are not an agent for the CIA, are you?
No.
No, you see, you laugh.
Yes, I do.
You are not an agent for the KGB, are you?
No.
Are you laughing again?
Well, you ridiculed me for
No,
laughing.
no,
once,
I
so
don't mean
won't
to
do it again.
ridicule you for it. I just want to know if you find the inquiry amusing.
No.
And is it a coincidence that it was you, Mrs. Paine?
Yeah.
Yes? Who directed Lee to the job that put him in the Texas School Book Depository?
Yes, I think that was clearly a coincidence.
And it's just a coincidence that the gun that supposedly killed the president was located in your house? That's a coincidence, isn't it?
What do you mean, coincidence?
I mean, it just happened. It's just, all of these things just sort of happened all around you. That's coincidence. You did give the FBI a letter that was supposed to have been written by Lee to the Soviet embassy, didn't you?
This was a draft of a letter that he left on my desk that
Yes.
concerned me very deeply because I could see he was lying in it.
He
And
left-
he used my typewriter, and that
He-
offended me deeply.
He left. It offended you that he
That
lied
he'd been
on
lying
your
on my
typewriter.
typewriter, that's right.
All right.
I didn't know who he was writing. The letter just said, "Dear Sirs."
And he left it right there for you
He
to
left
see?
it on my desk. I don't know why he left it there.
Yes. Doesn't it seem-
Just as strange as his leaving the light on in the garage.
Well, now,
to me.
wait a minute. We'll get to the light in the garage in just a minute.
I do think for the historical record, it's important that people understand that Lee was a very ordinary person. That
Well,
people can kill a president without that being something that shows on them in advance.
let me ask you a question. Is it really your purpose here to try to defame this man in some way?
I'd like a full picture. I
Yes.
think it's really important for
Yes, so do
history
I.
that a full picture of the man be seen.
Thank you.
I would
And
have
you
heard
don't
from-
know, first of all, let's find out what you do know and what you've surmised and what you don't know
Fair
and what
enough.
you've guessed at.
Mhm.
First of all, you do not know that there was ever a gun in that house, do you?
I never saw one, that's true.
You don't know that Lee Oswald or anybody else took a gun from that house, do you?
Not from my own observation, no.
You don't know that Lee turned on that light, do you?
It's just my surmise, you're right.
Thank you. Now, you talked to Lee after he was in jail, didn't you?
On the phone twice. Well,
And he was asking for help, wasn't he?
he asked me to call a particular lawyer, and he gave me a phone number.
Yes, he needed somebody to give him assistance.
Right. I said
Did you
I'd
think
call.
he should have it?
Yes, I thought he should have defense, a lawyer.
And were you amazed at the fact that about how completely certain Lee was as to his innocence?
Well, it wasn't that he said he was innocent. It was that it seemed remarkable to me that he could just ask blandly something of me at that point. He seemed so apart from the whole event, like it was nothing, like nothing had happened. And that was the presumption that I felt in his voice, like, nothing's happened.
But he
Yeah.
seemed presuming of his own innocence, did he not?
He seemed unattached.
Do you see any reason why you just can't turn to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury and say to them in clean, clear, honest English, he seemed presuming of his own innocence? That's true, isn't it?
That does not give the meaning that this whole passage you've quoted gives.
Thank you.
Because what I was saying was that he was unattached to the events that had just happened. That's the way he seemed to me.
Your Honor, the government moves to have all of its exhibits received as evidence, and the government rests at this time, Your Honor.
If you would, please, if you come forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Spence, if you'd call your first witness.
Call Bill Newman, please.
Well, sir, we were standing along the curb on Elm Street, and as the president's car come towards us, probably 200 feet or so from us, we heard a boom, boom, like that. The president sort of throwed his arms up, and we thought at that time maybe someone had thrown firecrackers or something beside the president's car. As the president's car came closer to us, we could see that something was wrong, that Governor Conley, I could see the blood on his shirt, and Governor Conley's eyes protruding. And the president was looking into the crowd of people. He was moving his head about and looking into the crowd of the people. And just as the president's car got directly in front of me, the president was probably 15 feet away, boom, and the side of his ear flew off, and just bits and pieces flew off. I can remember seeing just a white flash and then the red, and the president fell across the car as if you'd hit him with a bat. He fell across the car and back into Mrs. Kennedy's lap. I turned to, I remember her saying, "Oh my God, they've shot Jack."
Who was her?
Mrs. Kennedy. And then...
You were that close you could hear it?
Yes, sir. I was as close as from where you're standing to myself, from the president, when the third shot was fired.
Is that you, sir?
Yes, sir.
And that's your baby?
Yes, sir.
How big is that boy now?
Well, he's in Texas Tech University. He's now, I may be under oath, but I think he's 26 years old.
You may examine.
Let the record reflect you don't have to be 26 to go to Tech, so.
Okay.
Mr. Newman, you believe the shot to the president's head was the last shot, is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir, I do.
Mr. Newman, you have learned since the assassination that other things that you thought you saw and heard turned out to be not true, even though you thought you saw them with your very own eyes. Isn't that correct?
Give me an example, sir.
All right, I'll give you an example. This is Decker Exhibit number 5323. You've heard of Sheriff Decker from Dallas County?
Yes, sir.
Now, you gave him a statement. They typed it up, and you signed your name. You recognize your signature there, do you not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You gave him a statement on November the 22nd, 1963. I'll read a portion of it. We were standing at the edge of the curb looking at the car as it was coming towards us, and all of a sudden there was a noise, apparently gunshot. The president jumped up in his seat, and it looked like what I thought was a firecracker had went off, and I thought he had realized that it was just like an explosion, and he was standing up. Did you sign your name to that document?
I signed my name to that document.
You're aware that President Kennedy never stood up in the presidential limousine, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want to tell the folks?
Just a minute, if you don't mind. He would appreciate it if you'd stand up and ask
Yes,
a question.
yes.
Thank you.
Would you mind telling the folks in the jury what the circumstances were of you having written that document about the president standing up?
The part about the president standing up, the president did come up in his seat. And, of course, at that time I was pretty upset and excited myself, and I may have said the president stood up when all he in reality did was throw his arms up. That's all.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Newman.
you.
You may step down. Call your next witness.
I'm Tom Tilson, Dallas Police Department, Dallas, Texas, USA.
Mr. Tilson, were you around Dallas when our president was assassinated?
Yes, sir.
One of the things that I'd like to know is whether you knew a character by the name of Ruby. That is, a fellow by the name of Jack Ruby.
I did.
How did you happen to know him?
He had a Silver Spur dance hall on my beat.
How long had you known who Ruby was and what he looked like?
Oh, about 1956. Where I was, not quite on the map. I was right over here. This is the railroad track, and this is grassy knoll, just like Elm Street.
How about using this? Would it help you a little, Tom, if we gave you aerial photograph?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I like to be on the map, you know.
All right.
That's a little bit better. I was just about here, going in. I was back up there when I had a police radio on my car. And I heard that the president had just been shot up here.
Did you see anybody that looked like Jack Ruby on that day?
I did.
Where did you see him?
I saw him coming down the grassy knoll, getting in that car.
In this car that you've been talking about?
Yes, sir.
You're saying that the man that came down the grassy knoll and got in this car and drove off that you've been describing looked like Jack Ruby?
Yes, sir.
For the record, Jack Ruby was seen by one witness at 12:25 at the Dallas Morning News office, placing his regular weekly advertisement for his nightclubs, and by another witness at 12:40 in the same office. Now, you felt that Jack Ruby is the one that killed President Kennedy, right?
I couldn't swear to it.
But, I mean, you have that feeling.
The person I chased from the grassy knoll is the one that killed the President of the United States. Oswald did not kill the President.
Okay. Didn't you say to yourself, hey, they got the wrong guy, they should pick up Jack?
No, not until Jack shot him. When Jack shot Oswald, I said, nah, be darned, that's old Ruby, all right.
This license plate number, Tom, you eventually threw that away, did you not, sir?
I said, well, homicide didn't care about it, FBI didn't care about it, CIA didn't care about it, and it's been all these years, why keep it?
You never once called Dallas Homicide to find out, did you, Tom, whether they had followed up on what you had...
No, I didn't dare go in the office. I didn't have a white hat.
Court, please.
You may proceed.
Doctor, tell them who you are.
Dr. Cyril Wecht, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a pathologist specializing in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
Thank you. Would you tell the folks whether or not you were part of the President's, the House Committee's panel?
Yes, I was, Mr. Spence, one of the 9 forensic pathologists who had been convened by the Select Committee of Assassinations by the House of Representatives.
And you served with Dr. Petty, who the jury have already heard?
Yes.
Did you agree with the conclusions that Dr. Petty gave to the jury in this case?
No, not with what I would consider to be the principal, relevant, and important issues in this case. What this shows is a composite of several bullets. Bullets that were fired in an experiment conducted under the auspices and at the direction of the Warren Commission in 1964 at an Army base in Maryland near Washington, D.C. They fired 6.5 millimeter copper-jacketed lead core military-type ammunition first into cotton wadding, striking nothing.
Same as this gun? Same ammunition as this, out of this?
Exact same ammunition and from the same kind of weapon. Not Oswald's weapon, but another Mannlicher Carcano. These 2 bullets were fired into cotton wadding, striking nothing. Notice the deformity at the base. This bullet went through a goat carcass, breaking 1 rib of a goat. Notice it's widening. It even looks like a different bullet, but it's the same ammunition. That deformity is caused by the impact against 1 rib of a goat. And notice the extrusion of the lead core at the base. This bullet went through the wrist of a human cadaver, breaking the radius of a human cadaver, the same bone that was broken in Governor Connolly. In other words, they wanted to simulate, to reproduce the fractures that had occurred in the governor. So this one was to simulate the rib fracture, and this one was to simulate the wrist fracture. This bullet is not involved in this case. It's the same ammunition, not involved in this case.
Thank you.
And over here, a little off the screen, is Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called stretcher bullet, which, according to the government's theory, broke both the rib and the wrist in Governor Connolly, but emerged in near pristine condition, the only slight deformity at the base, otherwise the bullet completely intact. And yet here are the results of their experiment, and they chose the sample or representative bullets. I did not choose them.
I'm waiving my objection to all this, Your Honor.
I understand.
Obviously, totally and completely improper. He's given a summation to the jury, but I'm waiving the objection. Thank you, Your Honor. Let's Cyril enjoy himself.
If I am President Kennedy and I am moving down Elm Street and I'm shot in the head with a high-speed velocity long gun and I go backward and to the left like this, that is most consistent with a force of substantial nature coming in from the right side, the jury being in that area of the right side.
Would that be
driving me backwards?
Would that be consistent with a shot coming from the grassy knoll?
Yes, it would be.
You may examine.
Cyril, I respect you. You know, you've got a pretty good background, don't you?
Spent a lot of years in school.
But you're known as the darling of the conspiracy buffs in this country, aren't you?
Please, that's
Oh, wait a minute. You asked him to give a summation to the jury, and I can't ask him if he's a darling?
Please, I asked him for his testimony, Your Honor, and I think that that's demeaning of a witness of this character.
Ask him if he's a member of a particular committee. Sustain as to the darling
Doctor, even though from a professional perspective you don't think too much of the autopsy surgeons, you do agree 100% with their findings, to wit, that the bullet wound to the president's upper right back and the bullet wound to the back of the president's head were both entry wounds, not exit wounds, and hence the bullets were fired from the rear. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, let's go on to the next question now. No final summation. I'm going to be doing that. Was it just accidental on their part that they came to the same identical conclusion you came to?
That's not the same identical conclusion.
Okay.
That's just a part.
Dr. Wecht, in a 1974 article for Forensic Science, page 128, did you say this? So far as the available medical evidence shows, all shots were fired from the rear. No support can be found for theories which postulate gunmen to the front or right front of the presidential car. Did you write those words, Doctor?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Available medical evidence.
All
That's
right.
the phrase,
All right. Let's
Mr.
go on to other
Bugliosi.
questions.
Available medical evidence.
He'll have some opportunity on redirect. Just answer my questions.
You know, I think he is, and I don't think he's being fair with this witness, Your Honor. Somehow, when he gives an answer that he doesn't like, then he admonishes the witness and scolds him. And I think a witness ought to be able to answer without being scolded by
Objection's
Mr.
overruled.
Bugliosi.
I think Dr. Wecht's handling himself all right.
I think he's doing all right, too. Thank you.
As far as the brain, Doctor, you're well aware, are you not, that after interviewing or taking depositions from over 30 people close to the matter, the House Select Committee that you were on, the investigators concluded that the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, who had told people he feared his brother's brain might conceivably be placed on public display years from now, they came to the conclusion that it was he who was responsible for the disappearance of his brother's brain. You're aware of that? That's the conclusion of the House Select Committee investigators.
They suggested it.
Okay. But I take it you don't accept this possibility. You
Oh,
smell
I
it?
have no way of knowing.
Well, you kind of smell a rat here, don't you?
I have no way of knowing.
All right, let's go on. Head snap to the rear, Doctor. I believe you testified that that bullet could have come from the front. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Right side I prefer, Mr. Bugliosi.
You prefer?
Right side.
Yeah, but that's not Mr. He's not happy with
Oh,
that.
no, he did say right side, and I said right side, and he said grassy knoll, and I said yes, that's the right side.
But you want him to go home happy, don't you?
Oh, please.
And he's talking about the grassy
I have no
knoll.
relationship to Mr.
Okay.
Spence.
That's so bad.
Jury will disregard that.
So awful bad.
Okay, but the grassy knoll's to the right front.
Somewhat to the front, more to the side.
Okay. Well, Doctor, since you agree that there's no medical evidence of a bullet striking President Kennedy from the front, or right front, no medical evidence, to what do you attribute the head snap to the rear, then? There's no
I said, as you asked me before, Mr. Bugliosi, that the medical evidence available, I'll repeat for you, sir, that the left side of the brain was never opened, was never sectioned. So we don't know what was there. The great majority of the metal fragments inside the brain were never tested. Indeed, the large piece that was embedded in the bone in the back and a fairly substantial piece embedded toward the frontal part of the skull, those two were not removed and were not tested. So we don't know a lot of things about what happened because of the incompleteness of the examination and the unavailability of the evidence.
Do you believe that the two bullets that struck President Kennedy from behind were not fired from the southeasternmost window of the 6th floor, but from a lower floor?
My own analysis, as set forth in an article published, I think, in 1974, indicated that if the shots came from behind, and I believe that they had, that at least one of the shots would have been more likely to have come from around the 2nd floor of the Texas School Book Depository building and more down toward the other end of the building. That was my own analysis.
All right. Taking a look at this chart right here, Cyril.
Your Honor, I don't mean to be picky, but somehow it seems to me that during the course of this trial, we have always tried to show respect for people. And wouldn't it be proper for doctors to be called
Address him as Dr.
Oh,
West.
I'm sorry, Doctor.
All right.
Now, Doctor, if the bullet was coming on a downward path as it entered the presidential limousine, as you say it was, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And it missed Governor Connolly. Is that correct?
Yes.
Why didn't it hit the driver of the car or do any damage to the car, Doctor?
A couple of things. The straight line in that open limousine could have taken it out over the left side of the car.
No.
And as the line shows, it would have and could have indeed missed the driver. Secondly,
it's coming on a downward path, Ciro. I mean, Doctor, I'm sorry. It's coming on a downward path into the presidential limousine, goes through the president's body, misses Governor Connolly, and magically also misses the driver and doesn't do any damage to the presidential limousine.
Wait just a moment. I did not say that that bullet missed all of these people completely or that it missed the car.
Well, whom did it
You
miss?
know that there were fragments found in the car, Mr. Bugliosi.
You said the bullet passed on a straight line through the president's body.
Absolutely.
Passed through soft tissue.
That's
so
right.
So that bullet came out pristine.
That's right.
The bullet fragments found in the front seat of this car, Doctor, were bullet fragments, very, very damaged, very, very small. What happened to that pristine bullet when it came through President Kennedy's body?
What
Who did it hit?
happened to the third bullet under the Warren Commission theory, Mr. Bugliosi? Where is it? You're asking me to be responsible for the bullets
I want
in this
to know
case?
what happened to your bullet,
I'm
Doctor.
asking you what happened to the third bullet of the Warren Commission report.
You don't want to answer my question.
Doctor.
No, I don't have. I can't tell you where all the bullets are.
Doctor,
I didn't conduct the investigation.
Yeah, the prosecution has its own magic bullet, okay?
Mr. Bugliosi,
Now,
please, Dr. Weck, I'm going to ask you, please. I know that we've got some time constraints, but both of you sure like to talk at the same time, and Mrs. Zahn is still working for the court, and she can't take you both. So let's just slow it down just a little. Okay?
Dr. Weck,
Thank you.
you've suggested, Doctor, that maybe the bullets that entered from the right front, if there were any bullets from the right front, were synchronized, right? That at the very moment that the bullet was fired from the rear, someone else may have fired from the side or the right front. Is that correct?
Yes. A bullet, sir.
Yeah.
A
Now,
bullet.
how would the synchronization have taken place, Doctor?
Oh, that's very simple.
Was someone looking at a stopwatch with a rifle and also looking through the crosshairs?
You can do it according to a point in time. You can do it from a prearranged signal. You can do it with a stopwatch.
So they would be looking at the stopwatch and holding the rifle and at the same time looking through their sights. Is that correct?
In whatever way it's done. I haven't done much shooting like that
Have
recently.
you thought about it, Doctor?
Yes, I've thought about it.
Because...
Not a problem.
Okay,
not a problem with the right kind of watch and shooting with a good weapon. Not a problem.
Because it would have had to have hit within 1/18th of a second. Is that correct?
Yes.
You agree with that?
I agree. Well, not necessarily with 1/18th, but I agree within a fraction, and a small fraction of a second. Yes, I do agree.
Extremely, extremely remote. Isn't that right, Doctor?
I would say that it is a remote possibility, but a physical possibility to be considered.
Okay. Well, Doctor, by definition, it seems to me that you are saying that if the other 8 pathologists disagreed with you, and they did, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Seems to me, Doctor, that by necessary implication, they are either hopelessly and utterly incompetent or they deliberately suppress the truth from the American public. Is that correct?
There is a third alternative, which would be a hybrid, to some extent, of the deliberate suppression, sir. To some extent, a subconscious desire not to injure or aggrieve the government, from whom they look for various research grants and appointments and lectureships at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology and a variety of other...
Who are some of these other doctors? Aren't they doctors of good reputation and standing in the medical community?
You bring them here, sir, and present them to the jury. I can only present my testimony, show the pictures for His Honor and the jury. You bring the other 8 in and let them present their views.
So of the 9 pathologists, Dr. Weck, you're the only one that had the honor and the integrity and the professional responsibility to tell the truth to the American people. Is that correct, Doctor?
I'll prefer to put it this
thank
way.
you.
I'm
No
the
further
only one
questions.
who had the courage to say that the king was nude and had no clothes on. Yes.
No further questions.
All right, to redirect, thank you.
Just a couple of questions, Dr. Wecht. You've been asked by Mr. Bugliosi to try to explain what happened to the magic bullet as it was fired into the
president's limousine. Do you even believe that the magic bullet was fired into the president's limousine?
I have much doubts about where and when that bullet was fired, how it was found at Parkland Hospital, and how it may relate to other individuals who played a key role in this case who were seen at Parkland Hospital that afternoon.
Are you aware of the fact that Mr. Ruby, Jack Ruby, was at the Parkland Hospital that afternoon?
Yes, I have Mr. Ruby very much in mind.
And do you think that that bullet 399 is a true and genuine bullet that was fired at the time the president was murdered? Or do you think in reasonable medical probability, based on reasonable medical probability, that it's a fake and a fraud?
I have much doubt as to whether that bullet went through any of the individuals that day. If it did, it would be consistent only with a bullet having gone through the president's neck. It would not be consistent, for the reasons I've given, with a bullet that would have destroyed 4 to 5 inches of the governor's rib and caused a comminuted fracture of the governor's wrist.
No further questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weck. Call your next witness.
Mr. O'Connor, tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury who you are.
My name is Paul K. O'Connor. I was from Gainesville, Florida.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you were doing when you were 21 years old?
Yes.
What were you doing?
I was a hospital corpsman, United States Navy, and I was stationed in Bethesda, Maryland.
At Bethesda Hospital where the president was brought?
Yes, sir.
Were you present when they brought the president in?
Yes, sir.
And would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what your duties were at Bethesda Hospital at that time?
Well, I worked with a partner. We assisted in postmortem. My job in a postmortem was to remove the deceased brain.
Are you just a little bit nervous?
A little bit.
Well, I don't blame you. It's all right. Just take your time.
He was that close to me, I'd be a little worried too, Mr. O'Connor.
I'll back off.
Thank you.
Just we're all in this together, so just
I understand.
Just take your time.
Speak up just a little bit, if you would, please, Mr. O'Connor.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
As I said before, my job was to remove the deceased person's brain and prepare it for putting in formalin so it was fixed so that the pathologist could examine it at a later date. The president's brains were literally blown out of his head. He had none.
Are you saying that there was no brain in the president's head?
There was no brain. There were pieces of brain matter that were inside the cranium, just macerated pieces. Nothing that you could tell one part from the other.
Well, what do you mean there were pieces? How much of the brain was left in the skull?
Maybe a handful at the most.
You mean a full handful or what?
Maybe a half a handful.
Now, did you open the president's brain as you would in an ordinary case?
We didn't have to.
You mean you didn't peel the president's brain back?
No, sir. No. There was nothing to do. He had a monstrous hole in his head.
And so there was never a cut around or the hole or the brain taken out?
We didn't have to.
Because the brain wasn't there?
The brain was gone for all practical purposes. It was gone.
Well, when these people draw pictures of the brain, when these people say that there were pictures taken, photographs taken of the brain, what do you have to say about that?
They must be talking about somebody else.
Well, were you at the head of the president all during the time the autopsy was taken?
The whole time.
When people say that the brain was fixed in formaldehyde, is that true?
No.
Is that a lie, sir?
It has to be. There's no brain.
Thank you, sir. You may examine.
Mr. O'Connor, you were 21 at the time, sir? The time of the incident?
21 or 22. I'm not really sure right now, sir.
I have no doubt, Mr. O'Connor, that in a normal situation it would be you who would remove the brain from the decedent, but this obviously and unquestionably was not a normal situation. You certainly agree with me on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is it possible then that the autopsy surgeons would have done this, as opposed to you, in this situation, since it was so unusual?
Well, they did most of the mundane jobs that we did that night.
Okay. But they did not remove the brain from the body.
There was no brain to be removed.
The official autopsy report in this case, Mr. O'Connor, dated November the 22nd, 1963, states on page 4, the brain is removed and preserved for further study following formalin fixation. Also, from the surface of the disrupted right cerebral cortex, 2 small irregularly shaped fragments of metal are recovered. These measure 7 by 2 millimeters and 3 by 1 millimeter. These are placed in the custody of agents Francis X. O'Neill, Jr. and James W. Siebert of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who executed a receipt therefor. Now, Mr. O'Connor, 3 surgeons signed their name to this autopsy report. Are you saying that none of these things happened?
Not to my knowledge, they didn't.
Okay. Now, Mr. O'Connor, if the president's brain being missing from his head is one of the most shocking things that you've ever seen in your entire life, a matter that you think should have been investigated, certainly, and if they spoke to you for 1.5 hours about your observations that night, why wasn't it important enough for you to tell these people about it?
I was under orders not to talk until that time.
What?
I was under orders not to talk to anybody.
By whom?
By the United States military brought in orders a couple of days after the autopsy, and we were to remain silent.
But you talked to them for 1.5 hours. You told them all types of things in that document.
I received permission from the Select Committee on Assassinations to talk through the Secretary of Navy and Secretary of Defense.
Paul, when I first asked you this question over the phone, did you tell me the reason I never told them is they never asked me?
Well, they didn't ask me.
And that's why you didn't tell them?
Yes.
So in other words, Mr. O'Connor, even though this is one of the most shocking things that you've ever seen, and you're going to remember it to the day you die, and you feel this matter should have been investigated, if those investigators from the House Select Committee didn't ask you the magic question, by golly, you're not about to tell them it. Is that correct?
No, sir. I only answered what I was asked, and that was it.
I see.
Elaborate.
Thank you. No further questions.
Fine. Thank you, Mr. O'Connor. You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Spence, Judge Bunton, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the brief time I have to address you in this historic trial, I want to point out what must already be obvious to you, that Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone is responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, our young and vigorous leader whose presidency stirred the hopes of millions of Americans for a better world and whose shocking death grieved and anguished an entire nation. But before I summarize that evidence for you against Mr. Oswald, evidence that conclusively proves his guilt beyond all reasonable doubt, I want to discuss several issues with you which the defense has raised during this trial. Several factors make it clear that Kennedy and Connally were struck by the same bullet. There's absolutely no evidence of the existence of any separate bullet hitting Connally. With respect to whether or not any shots were fired from the grassy knoll, I want to make the following observations. Firstly, it is perfectly understandable that the witnesses were confused as to the origin of fire. Not only does Dealey Plaza resound with echoes, but here you have a situation of completely unexpected shots over just a matter of a few moments. When you compound all of that with the fact that the witnesses were focusing their attention on the President of the United States driving by, a mesmerizing event for many of them, and the chaos, the hysteria, the bedlam that engulfed the assassination scene, it's remarkable that there was any coherence at all to what they thought they saw and heard. Human observation, notoriously unreliable under even the most optimum situation, has to give way to hard scientific evidence. And we do have indisputable scientific evidence in this case that the bullets which struck President Kennedy came from his rear, not his front. If either of the 2 bullets that struck President Kennedy came from the front, why weren't there any entrance wounds to the front of the president's body, nor any exit wounds to the rear of his body? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it couldn't be more obvious that there was no gunman at the grassy knoll. No one saw anybody with a rifle in that area. No weapon, nor expended cartridges from a weapon were found there. it didn't happen. With respect to Ruby killing Oswald, the evidence is overwhelming that he was a very emotional man. When we couple the fact that Ruby cared deeply for Kennedy with the fact that he probably thought that he would be viewed as a hero, Ruby's killing of Oswald has all the earmarks of a very personal killing, completely devoid of any outside influence. In the short time I have left, I want to summarize the evidence of guilt against Mr. Oswald. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, within minutes of the assassination, a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle, serial number C-2766, was found on the 6th floor of the book depository building. Oswald ordered the rifle under the name A. Hedel. We know that. We know from the testimony of Monty Lutz, the firearms expert, that the 2 large bullet fragments found inside the presidential limousine were parts of a bullet fired from Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all other weapons. We also know from the firearms people that the 3 expended cartridge casings found on the floor right beneath that 6th floor window, undoubtedly the same casings that Mr. Norman heard fall from above, were fired in and ejected from Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all other weapons. So we know, not just beyond a reasonable doubt, we know beyond all doubt that Oswald's rifle was the murder weapon that caused that terrible, terrible spray of brain matter to the front. The worst sight that I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's obvious that Oswald carried that rifle into the building that day in that large brown paper bag. It couldn't be more obvious. As far as Mr. Frazier's testimony about Oswald carrying the bag under his armpit, he conceded he never paid close attention to just how Oswald was carrying that bag. He didn't have any reason to. At this point, if we had nothing else, how much do you need? If we had nothing else, this would be enough to prove Oswald's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. But there's so much more. Let's look at Oswald's conduct. November the 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination, was a Friday. Whenever Oswald would go to visit his wife in Irving, go on a Friday evening, come back on a Monday morning. On the week of the assassination, however, for the very first time, he goes there on a Thursday evening, obviously to get his rifle for the following day. After the assassination, all the other employees of the book depository building return to work. There's a roll call. They're accounted for. Not Oswald. He takes off. The only employee who leaves the building. Just 45 minutes after the assassination, out of the 500,000 or so people in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald is the one out of those 500,000 people who just happens to murder Officer J.D. Tippit. Oswald's responsibility for President Kennedy's assassination explains why he was driven to murder Officer Tippit. The murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. What other reason under the moon would he have had to kill Officer Tippit? Normally, ladies and gentlemen, in a murder case, a verdict of guilty brings about a certain measure of justice, obviously a limited amount of justice, but a certain measure of justice for the victim and his or her surviving loved ones. But here, the effect of this assassination went far beyond President Kennedy and his family. This was an enormous offense against the American people. And no justice could ever be achieved. I respectfully ask you to return a swift verdict of guilty against Lee Harvey Oswald, simply because it is the only verdict that is consistent with the evidence, evidence which conclusively proves Oswald's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Bugliosi.
That means that all of the proof has to come from the government. And they have to prove this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove every element of this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And when there are reasonable doubts that are raised by this evidence, which was my obligation to do, fairly if I could. They must dispel those doubts. Not one of them, not two of them, not 17 of them, but the raft of doubts that you have heard in this case have to somehow disappear unanimously in the minds of every one of you. And I need to say something to you that's very important to me. Each one of you have the power individually to say no. If one single doubt remains in your mind, you have the right and the responsibility and the duty to have the courage to say no. And I turn to Lee Oswald and I say, Lee Oswald, this jury is composed of people that have the courage to say no. That's what I'd say to Lee Oswald in this case. Is it just a coincidence that the job, hear it please, is it just a coincidence that the job that put Lee Harvey Oswald in the bookstore was a job that Mrs. Paine got for him? What about it, Lee? I wish you could tell us. I wish you could explain to us whether those are just coincidences. Please. Isn't it a coincidence that in the hospital, there was Mr. Ruby again? How comes he appears over and over everywhere? If you were going to kill the president and you wanted to escape, would you take 3 seconds or 1 second to pick up the 3 shells and leave? Was that what you would do? Or would you just leave them there so they could now tie them into the gun? With respect to the hiding of the gun, would you have figured out some place to hide the gun, or would you just leave it out there almost in plain sight? Would you have shot the president from the place where you work? I mean, if you're going to shoot somebody, do you go down and plan the shooting so that you do it from your work? I mean, you don't have an escape. You can't drive a car. There's nobody to take you out of there. Is that what you would do? Or was he, as he said, a patsy? And so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I give you and place into your hands the history of this country and the case of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Based on the evidence in this case, Lee Harvey Oswald is as guilty as sin, and there's nothing that Mr. Spence can do about it. I have yet to see the man who can convince 12 reasonable men and women, as you folks are, that black is white and white is black. Mr. Spence, in his argument to you, no more desired to look at the evidence in this case than one would have a desire to look directly into the noonday sun. And I can't really blame him, because if I were he, I wouldn't want to either. Because there's not one tiny grain of evidence, not one microscopic speck of evidence that anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Mr. Spence did say this. It was kind of a subtle, very clever argument. Took me a while to grasp exactly what he was doing. I think he said this, and if I misrepresent you, sir, I'm sorry, but I think he said that Lee Harvey Oswald was the exact type of person to set up as a patsy. Or words to that effect. I'm just paraphrasing him. A Marxist, a defector to Soviet Russia. Actually, he was the exact type of person to murder the president. And my colleague very cleverly turned it around and said he's the exact type of person to make us a patsy. Let's take a look at Oswald. Can anyone fail to see how utterly and completely crazy this man here was? Utterly and completely nuts, bonkers. One example among many. And you have to be bonkers to commit a presidential murder. You've got to be crazy, nuts. One example among many. How many Americans, how many people anywhere in the world defect to the Soviet Union? That alone shows how completely and utterly mentally unhinged this man was. Again, the exact type of person to kill the president. Though he may or may not have had any personal dislike for Kennedy. We don't know that. For all we know, maybe he didn't think Kennedy was that bad a person. Everything is relative in life. However, I think one thing is pretty obvious. Kennedy almost undoubtedly would have represented to Oswald the ultimate quintessential representative. That's the key word, representative, of a society for which he had a grinding contempt. On the issue of conspiracy, Mr. Spence, I'm paraphrasing him, he certainly didn't say who specifically murdered the president, but he certainly implied to you that it was some nebulous, some powerful group. He never put the hat on anyone. He kept the hat on his table here. I thought he was going to put it on someone's head, but he didn't. Some mysterious group, powerful group, murdered the president and framed Lee Harvey Oswald, but he didn't say who these people were. He did say the CIA covered up here. He said the FBI covered up there. In which case, if the FBI and CIA were covering up, they'd be the ones who murdered the president, right? Why doesn't Mr. Spence come right out and say it? Why doesn't he accuse the CIA and the FBI of murdering the president? There's one thing you can say about Mr. Spence. He's not a shy man. He knows how to exercise his First Amendment freedom of speech. But he doesn't say it because he's very intelligent, very wise. I'll tell you why he doesn't say it. Because he knows that if he said that the FBI murdered the president or the CIA murdered the president, it would sound downright silly. You'd laugh at him. But even though neither the CIA nor organized crime would have any productive motive whatsoever to kill the president, let's make the unwarranted assumption that they did, that they had such a motive, and let's go on and discuss Mr. Spence's next point about Ruby killing Oswald. Mafia contract killers are always selected with utmost care. I mean, the one chosen to kill Oswald would be everything that Jack Ruby was not. He'd be someone who had a long track record of effectively carrying out murder contracts before for them and would be a precise, unemotional, businesslike, and above all, tight-lipped killer for hire. The whole notion of sophisticated groups getting, like organized crime and U.S. intelligence, getting Jack Ruby of all people to accomplish a job which, if he talked, would prove fatal to their existence is just downright laughable. When Mr. Spence argued that Oswald was just a patsy and was framed, he conveniently neglected to be specific. How was Lee Harvey Oswald framed? When we look at the mechanics of such a possible conspiracy in this case, how could he have been framed? Let's get into the mechanics. Who was this other gunman who on the day of the assassination made his way into the book depository building, carrying a rifle, went up to the 6th floor, shot and killed the president, made his way back down to the 1st floor, and escaped without leaving a trace? How, in fact, if Oswald were innocent, did they get Oswald within 45 minutes of the assassination to murder Officer Tippit? Or was he framed for that murder too? Mr. Spence can't have it both ways. If the people who set Oswald up were so sophisticated to come up with this incredible, elaborate conspiracy, I mean, to the point they had people, according to Mr. Spence, who can superimpose this man's head on someone else's body. And imposters down in Mexico City. If they were that bright, why weren't they intelligent enough to know the most obvious thing of all? That you don't attempt to frame a man of questionable marksmanship ability who possesses a $19 mail-order rifle. As surely as I am standing here, as surely as night follows day, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, is responsible for the murder of President John F. Kennedy. You are 12 reasonable men and women, and that is why I have every confidence that you will confirm this fact for the pages of history by your verdict of guilty. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You may be seated. I have a note here which reads as follows. Your Honor, we have reached a unanimous verdict dated November 22, 1986, signed Jack Morgan, foreperson. Mr. Morgan, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
If you would, please, if you just hand it to the marshal. You may be seated.
Verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Lee Harvey Oswald guilty of the offense charged in 1 of the indictment.
After returning a verdict of guilty, the jury was asked to consider whether Oswald had acted alone or with others. The majority concluded that he was the sole assassin.